Welcome. Modern conservatism comes out of the French Revolution, or more accurately, modern conservatism comes from rejecting the French Revolution. The most famous such work is probably Reflections on the Revolution in France by Edmund Burke, which was published in 1790. It rapidly entered Europe, where it found an international audience. One was Joseph de Maistre, often seen as Burke's French equivalent. Another was Friedrich Gentz, a Prussian nobleman who also translated Burke into German. Today, we'll look at all three authors and their works. They are among the most important critics of revolutionary France, and we'll consider some of how conservative political ideas have both changed and remained the same. History is full of ironies. Edmund Burke, an Anglo-Irish philosopher and British MP, is often considered the fountainhead of conservative political thought. In truth, Burke is something of an odd fit for the position of founder of conservatism. There's no shortage of reasons. He defended the American Revolution, he sought to expand the civil rights of Catholics, and perhaps most importantly, he never set out to create a new political philosophy. But perhaps this gets at something that is crucial to conservatism. It doesn't claim to look forward. It entertains few if any notions of progress. And this is probably best seen with how Burke contrasted the French Revolution with the Glorious Revolution, which took place in England in 1688. During that revolution, William, Prince of Orange, invaded England and took the throne from James II, who fled, although he later sought to return with military force. William's supporters alleged that James would try and force his religion, Catholicism, upon the English people, who were largely Protestant, and this caused a constitutional crisis. But it may be worth noting that none of this changed England's form of government, which remained a monarchy. Burke described the Glorious Revolution as an event made to preserve our ancient, indisputable laws and liberties, and that ancient constitution of government, which is our only security for law and liberty. So Burke did not oppose change as such, but he did oppose the French Revolution. It might not be too much to say that the Glorious Revolution was Burke's primary point of reference for critiquing the French Revolution. In his reflections, Burke drew upon a very British mentality. For example, in 1755, in his famous dictionary, Samuel Johnson included a political definition for the word revolution, defining it as change in the state of a government or country. It is used among us for the change produced by the admission of King William and Queen Mary. We find the same in other dictionaries. 20 years later, in 1775, John Ashe included the following in his definition of the word revolutioner: one who approves of the change produced by the admission of King William and Queen Mary. Of course, revolutioner is a word that has fallen out of common English usage, probably because it was later replaced by the word revolutionary, a word with a French etymology, the word révolutionnaire. All of this is to say that if we want to understand Burke's opposition to the French Revolution, we have to take seriously his view of the Glorious Revolution. Unusually, at least for many today, Burke believed that political order was natural, and thus the best order was one rooted in the order of nature. He believed that English political history worked in this natural way. He wrote, "By preserving the method of nature in the conduct of the state, in what we improve, we are never wholly new. In what we retain, we are never wholly obsolete." But his view of France was quite different. The French Revolution, he says, strayed out of the high road of nature, because it embraced new theories and practices, thus undercutting its many centuries of organic growth. And this, for Burke, was key. There was no way to stop change. Change was and is inevitable, but you have to remain rooted. Consistency matters. He didn't consider this conservative. For him, it was properly British. It was only a few years before Burke began influencing others. Among the most eloquent was Joseph de Maistre, whose work carried the similar title, Considerations on France. It was published in 1797. But de Maistre does not imitate Burke. He makes only a single passing reference to him. The genre of Maistre's Considerations is different than Burke's reflections. The Considerations did not begin as a series of letters, but instead is a philosophical essay. You might even call it theological. Burke was an ecumenically minded Protestant, but de Maistre was a convinced Catholic. He was deeply concerned with how to reconcile the French Revolution with belief in God and divine providence. De Maistre was keenly aware of the attacks that French Catholics, and especially clergy, had endured. For example, he described the French Revolution's new calendar as a conspiracy against religion. He also devoted an entire chapter to what he called the anti-religious character of the French Revolution. De Maistre saw the Revolution in fundamentally religious terms, namely as a rebellion against God and God's created order. There are some fantastic zingers in the Considerations on France. One of his observations is that the revolutionaries were, on the whole, unimpressive. They were distinguished only by their extremism. He writes, "Belief is one of the characteristics of the revolution, because the revolution could succeed only by the scope and power of the revolutionary spirit, or, if one may put it another way, by faith in the revolution." He further called the revolutionaries mediocre, untalented, and ignorant. But this also gets at his view that the French Revolution was a matter of faith, a new faith, and very much a non-Christian one. Burke also influenced Friedrich von Gentz, a Prussian nobleman who wrote in 1800 a comparative study, The Origins and Principles of the American Revolution, compared with the origin and principles of the French Revolution. It was a work with international influence. In fact, within just a few months of publication, it was translated into English by John Quincy Adams, who later became the 6th President of the United States. And it might be best that we begin with Adams himself. In his own words, Gentz wrote, "The clearest accounts of the rise and progress of the American Revolution, and therefore a work that rescues that revolution from the disgraceful imputation of having proceeded from the same principles as that of France." So what then was von Gentz arguing? He identified a series of contrasts between the two revolutions. For example, he argued that the American Revolution was fundamentally defensive, but the French Revolution was fundamentally offensive. The American Revolution aimed to preserve a way of life that taxation would have altered, but the French Revolution aimed to destroy the French kingdom itself. He further compared the amount of violence between the two revolutions. Writing after the Terror, von Gentz was understandably horrified by the indiscriminate killing of French citizens and especially clergy. He was no less horrified by the aggression that the French revolutionaries showed towards other nations. The American Revolution, he wrote, had at no time and in no way so much as called in question, much less attacked, the lawfulness of other constitutions. But the French Revolution had done exactly that, challenging monarchy as such, and engulfing multiple European nations in war. If that was the outcome of the French Revolution, von Gentz understandably wanted nothing to do with it. So what? Although these are the origins of conservative political thought, there's a lot of distance between late 18th century opposition to the French Revolution and modern conservatism. But this shouldn't be surprising. Every belief system has a history. For now, I want to point out two things, one similarity and one difference between early conservative politics, which began at the turn of the 19th century, and now. First, conservative politics began in part as a defense of monarchy, but it was also, in many ways, a defense of established religion. In fact, in his reflections, Burke feared that the revolution would turn against religion, and this years before the French Revolution actually did so. Perhaps it is unsurprising that Burke and de Maistre both believed in a state church. Consider de Maistre's view that either every imaginable institution is founded on a religious concept, or it is only a passing phenomenon. Institutions are strong and durable to the degree that they are, so to speak, deified. This is rather different than the approach of the U.S. Constitution, which disestablished religion at the federal level, although individual states maintained state churches into the early 19th century. I imagine that many conservatives today, regardless of nationality, will be less comfortable with an established religion or established church. But there are also points of similarity between earlier and later conservative thinkers, and this is perhaps best seen in the skepticism toward abstract philosophical ideas, especially about rights. For von Gentz, the French Revolution lost itself in philosophical speculation. He described the phrase rights of man as a sort of magic spell with which all the ties of nations and of humanity were insensibly dissolved. And he goes on to argue, the leaders of the revolution, under the shelter of this talisman, spared themselves and others the trouble of inquiring into the lawfulness of their proceedings. In other words, they self-justified by making a political faith claim, and, like all faith claims, it's something you can believe but not really prove. And yet, their political works or actions were far from justified. The revolutionaries rebelled against the king and put their fellow citizens to the sword. For individuals like Burke, de Maistre, and von Gentz, freedom and rights had become tyrannical because they were divorced from the actual existing laws of actual existing political communities. And I suspect that this is a view that many conservatives today would still agree with. If you're interested in learning more, these books are worth consulting. As with all history, the best place to start is probably with the primary sources themselves. To review, today we've looked at the following. First is Reflections on the Revolution in France by Edmund Burke. Still today, at least in the English-speaking world, it's an extremely popular work, and it's available in a variety of editions. I've used the version edited by John Pocock and published by Hackett Books. Second, and unlike Burke, Joseph de Maistre's works are much harder to find in English translation, but you can find his Considerations on France. It's translated by Richard Lebrun and published in the series Cambridge Text and the History of Political Thought. It has an appallingly bad introduction by Isaiah Berlin. Finally, there's Friedrich von Gentz, The Origin and Principles of the American Revolution compared with the origin and principles of the French Revolution. The only edition that I know of is the original 1800 translation by John Quincy Adams, reprinted by the Liberty Fund. This edition does, however, have a number of helpful notes by its editor, Peter Kozlowski. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching. Please hit the subscribe button, feel free to leave a comment, and I'll see you next time.